In the spring of 547 BC, a pivotal moment in ancient history approached. The first swallows were returning to the marble temples of Ionia. Above Sardis, the capital of Lydia, snow still capped Mount Tmolus. Croesus, son of Alyattes, stood on his palace's golden balcony. He was, by all accounts, the wealthiest man who had ever lived. His city was legendary, streets paved with white marble, roofs tiled with beaten gold. The gold flashed so brightly that travelers had to shade their eyes. The river Pactolus ran thick with gold dust, which Lydian women habitually panned while singing. In the great 100-columned audience hall, ambassadors knelt before a throne of solid electrum. Beyond the walls, 10,000 snow-white Nisaean horses exercised at dawn. Their silver bridles chimed like distant temple bells. Croesus smiled, for the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, the voice that had never failed him, had spoken clearly. The prophecy was direct. If Croesus crosses the Halys, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus had sent Delphi golden lions weighing 10 talents each. He had gilded the roof of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus and sacrificed 3,000 oxen in a single day. He knew exactly which empire was doomed, the new Persian kingdom of Cyrus. Cyrus was the wild horseman who had overthrown his grandfather Astyages only 4 years earlier. Croesus summoned his generals, Greek mercenaries from Miletus and Samos, and contingents from Babylon, Egypt, and distant Sparta. In the spring of 547 BC, he crossed the Halys River with the most magnificent army Western Asia had ever assembled. He was certain he marched to destroy the Persian threat permanently. He believed the golden age of Lydia would now shine for 1,000 years. Cyrus, however, had already learned the strategic lessons that would define his conquests. He understood that while Lydian cavalry was invincible on open terrain, horses cannot endure the odor of camels. He knew that the Anatolian plateau in late summer turns vegetation to tinder. An army that cannot adequately sustain its mounts is already half defeated. Cyrus correctly anticipated that Croesus would interpret the Delphic Oracle literally and drastically overextend his supply lines. As the Lydian host advanced into Cappadocia, Cyrus refused the direct open battle that Croesus desperately sought. He executed a systematic day-by-day retreat. His forces burned every village and granary behind them, driving off all flocks. The once rich plain was intentionally transformed into a desert. Soon the renowned white horses of Lydia began to fail and starve. Their ribs became visible beneath the rich purple saddlecloths. Croesus, interpreting the retreat as fear, pushed his army deeper into hostile territory. He continued farther and farther from his established supply network. One evening before the city of Pteria, he pitched his camp. He was confident that Cyrus would not dare face him. That night, while the Lydian sentries slept under the full moon, Cyrus initiated one of the most audacious maneuvers in the history of ancient warfare. He marched his entire army in absolute silence on a vast northern arc. He forded the upper Halys at a location previously deemed impassable. Persian troops used inflated goat skins and reed rafts, moving entirely under the cover of darkness. At dawn, the Lydian scouts looked up from their breakfast preparations. They saw the rising sun glinting on 100,000 Persian spear points. Cyrus's royal standard flew on the western bank, positioned between the Lydians and their route home. Croesus awoke to the sound of war horns and the chilling knowledge that he had been decisively outgeneraled by the man he had scorned as a barbarian. The subsequent battle lasted less than 3 hours and resolved the fate of Western Asia. Croesus arrayed his cavalry with their legendary magnificence. 10,000 white horses wheeled in perfect synchronization, the ground shaking under their hooves. The riders, in gold and silver scale armor, flashed like the sun on water. Croesus launched them in a single thunderous charge toward the Persian center. He fully expected to breach the lightly armed eastern archers, a tactic successful for a century, but Cyrus had precisely anticipated this movement. He ordered his baggage camels brought forward in a single long line. Their packs were loaded with straw, which was then deliberately set alight. When the Lydian horses closed to 100 paces, they were struck by a wall of heat and the potent, musky stench of camel. No warhorse can endure this specific odor. The famous white chargers immediately reared violently and bolted in every direction. They threw their riders, trampling their own supporting infantry. The pride of Lydia dissolved into chaos. Screaming animals, broken lances, and men dying beneath the hooves of their own mounts. Into this chaos, the Persian archers advanced with perfect formation. They unleashed volley after volley of iron-tipped arrows that fell like black rain. The plain was soon completely carpeted with feathered shafts, and the white horses of Lydia ran crimson. Croesus, watching from a small hill as his invincible cavalry disintegrated, felt the cold touch of true, paralyzing fear. When the Persian heavy lancers pressed their assault, he ordered the immediate retreat. He lost half his elite cavalry and most of his Greek mercenaries in under 3 hours. Croesus galloped the 300 miles back to Sardis with the surviving remnants of his force. He dismissed his remaining allies and sent urgent appeals by sea to distant Sparta and Babylon. He convinced himself that the campaigning season was over. He rationalized that Cyrus would be forced to winter in Cappadocia and that the gods would still protect his city. He was incorrect in every single assumption. Cyrus did not pause to consolidate or celebrate his victory. He force-marched his entire army across the Anatolian plateau in an extraordinary 14 days. This rapid pace was an achievement Greek historians later declared impossible. The army subsisted entirely on captured grain and flocks. They moved so swiftly that the dust raised by the vanguard had not settled before the rearguard appeared. They covered 30 miles daily across the intentionally scorched countryside. On the 14th night following the Battle of Pteria, Cyrus reached his objective. Croesus was still performing horse sacrifices to Apollo on the Acropolis. He continued assuring his nervous courtiers that the walls of Sardis were utterly unbreachable. The sentries on the impregnable citadel, famed for its steep, lion-guarded battlements, looked down. They saw the plain below blackened with Persian campfires stretching to both horizons. The richest city on earth awoke to find itself besieged by a man who had been a mere vassal king only 4 years prior. The Siege of Sardis lasted precisely 14 days. The citadel stood on a rock spur, virtually vertical on 3 sides. Its walls were constructed of massive, tightly fitted stone blocks without mortar. Its sole vulnerability was a narrow ridge on the northeast, which Croesus had left lightly guarded. He believed the ridge was too steep for any invading army to climb. The Lydians mocked the Persians from the battlements, watching them attempt climbs that challenged mountain goats. However, on the 13th night, a Persian soldier, Halys of the Mardian contingent, observed a fatal security lapse. He saw a Lydian sentry carelessly drop his helmet over the wall and climb down an unguarded gully to retrieve it. The following morning, while Croesus slept securely, believing Apollo's protection was absolute, the final assault began. 14 elite Persians in full armor, led by Hieraides, ascended the impossible cliff in single file. They moved only during bursts of wind, masking the sound of their boots on the rock. Their shields were secured on their backs, their swords held carefully between their teeth. Reaching the summit, they found the battlements deserted. The Lydians were enjoying their breakfast. The small Persian team quickly opened a postern gate, admitting the entire invasion force. By the time Croesus was violently roused from his bed, the palace was already consumed by fire. His vast treasury was being systematically looted by Persian soldiers who wept at the sheer volume of gold. His wives and daughters were dragged screaming into the streets. The richest king on earth was soon bound in heavy golden chains before the very man he had intended to destroy. Cyrus, seated on a simple camp stool amidst the ruins of the 100-columned hall, now addressed the defeated king. He asked one pivotal question: "Who persuaded you to march against my land and thus become my enemy instead of remaining at peace?" Croesus, bracing for the execution pyre prepared for him, offered the profound, bitter truth. "It was the oracle of the Greeks that persuaded me," he confessed. "Apollo told me that if I crossed the Halys, I would destroy a great empire, and I mistakenly believed that empire was yours." Cyrus paused in silence for a prolonged moment. Then he broke into laughter, the only instance any chronicler ever documented the conqueror of Asia laughing during wartime. Cyrus responded, "Then you have fulfilled the prophecy perfectly, Croesus, for the great empire you destroyed was your own." Instead of executing his intended destroyer, Cyrus immediately commanded the removal of the chains. He seated Croesus by his side and retained him as a highly respected, honored advisor for the rest of his life. Even the greatest conqueror the world had yet seen could respect a man who had lost everything, yet still held on to absolute truth. In a devastating span of only 14 days, the Golden Kingdom of Lydia, a historical wonder, ceased to exist. Its treasury, containing sufficient gold and silver to finance centuries of armies, was loaded onto 10,000 mules. This enormous wealth was transported east to Ecbatana, Pasargadae, and the future royal city of Persepolis. Lydia's formidable cavalry became the integral nucleus of the Persian heavy horse. Later instrumental in battles like Gaugamela, its capital, Sardis, became the western administrative center of an empire that now spanned from the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush. Cyrus stood on the banks of the Pactolus, where the legendary King Midas supposedly washed away his golden touch. He watched the water run red with Lydian blood and glitter with gold dust carried from the burning palace. Cyrus knew that the first true Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, had been birthed through fire, audacious strategy, and the ruin of the richest king who ever lived. This king trusted the gods but discovered too late that even Apollo sometimes speaks in complex riddles that only the ultimate victor fully understands.